Okay.
Welcome, everybody. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
And before we get into the topic for today, Miriam, could you make your comment again for everybody? Because I want to respond to it with a story, actually.
With my, well, I'm reading Guide for the Perplexed. And so Maimonides is at the forefront of my mind. And this parasha has a lot of commandments. I know there are over 50, I think there's 70 something, but
It's over 70, yes.
Okay, over 70. And some of them are, well, I won't say beyond our comprehension, but I guess I would say they're historically based. They're there for a particular reason. But I think Maimonides would disagree with me. I think Maimonides' position on all of the commandments are either we just can't understand them because they're out of human comprehension, or that there's a purpose to every single commandment, and it's and all the commandments bring us closer to God. So if I understand Maimonides correctly, that's what I got out of it so far.
Yes, and I think that Maimonides eventually, you'll see, you'll recognize that he was very much an elitist and an elitist thinker, and ultimately suggests that there's a small percentage of people which he describes as a chassid, the chassid, who has the capacity, the intellectual capacity, to understand the deeper meaning of the mitzvot. But the vast majority of everybody else, who he calls Am Haaretz, the earthy people, do not have the capacity to understand the deeper esoteric meanings behind the mitzvot, but the mitzvot is there for them especially. And he kind of illustrates the difference between different ways of loving God. And he introduces into Judaism this notion of an intellectual love of God. Through intellectually studying the details and the depth of the commandments, that is, again, limited in capacity to a small number of people. And then on the other hand, there's a way of loving God through obedience of the commandments, even if they're not understood. I say ironically, there's a story from rabbinic tradition, a very famous story that speaks to Maimonides' perspective. The notion that God gives the commandments and then humans have to make something out of that. Some will make something out of it intellectually, and others will make something out of it by observance or obedience. There is this very famous story about a group of disciples of a rabbi, and I apologize, I'm blanking on the names of the rabbis in the story, but they're the disciples of a rabbi, and one rabbi as a group who are arguing with a great rabbinic sage about whether or not a certain oven is kosher. It's a very famous story about the tanur, the famous tanur, the oven, whether it be kosher or not. And I'm just going to pick the names. Rabbi Eliezer, who's the great sage, says clearly, this oven is kosher. And the disciples and the other rabbi, who are a clear majority, say, no. this oven is not kosher. And Rabbi Eliezer says, well, I'm so sure this oven is kosher that this river running right here will change direction and run upstream. And right before their eyes, the river changes direction and runs upstream. And the disciples of the other rabbi, who are the majority, say, well, that's all well and good, the river changed direction, but we've still decided the oven isn't kosher.
Wow.
So Rabbi Eliezer says, well, you know, I'm so sure that this oven is kosher that the walls of the house of study will begin to shake. And right before their eyes, the walls of the house of study begin to shake. And the disciples with the other rabbi who formed the majority say, well, that's all well and good. But we've decided the oven isn't kosher, can't be used. So finally, Rabbi Eliezer says, look, I'm so sure this oven is kosher, there'll be a bat kol, which means a voice from the heavens. A bat kol will declare that the oven is kosher. And right before their eyes, there's a voice from heaven. Rabbi Eliezer has spoken wisely. The oven is indeed kosher. This tanor can be used. And to that, the disciples and the other rabbi, they see it, they hear it, and their answer is, that's all well and good. But God gave the Torah to us here on earth. And it's up to us to decide and interpret it. And the story ends with a very terse little sentence that says, God has observed all this interaction, and that God falls back in God's throne with a smile, saying, and here it is, my children have overtaken me.
Can I say something?
Sure.
I know that's the way the majority of people interpret that story, but I also heard from an eminent rabbi another interpretation that this was a point of separation from God, that God was showing the way and people were going their own way. So that's.
I didn't even tell you my interpretation.
Oh, okay. I'm
Yes.
sorry.
Yeah, no, that's just the story. Yes, I mean, there's one interpretation exactly as you said. It's actually the most common interpretation, which is it's a story of estrangement, of where it's, you know, the Jewish people assuming authority on the one hand, which is an extension of the fact that God gave them the mind and the free will to interpret and decide. But the other interpretation is that God takes pleasure in the independence of the Jewish people to interpret the law, even if they get it wrong. So that the process, God celebrated that process, even though saying, they overtook me, but it's with a smile, God says it. That's the key part there, that God took joy actually in seeing this wrestling match go on. Because that was really considered the ideal to, we talk about wrestling with the halakha, wrestling with the mitzvot, to try to understand it. So that God applauds, even if we get it wrong. And the reason I think it's such an interesting, what you raise, Miriam, in your question, is in a sense, Maimonides is going along with that interpretation, that God celebrates the process, the effort, the loving effort to try to understand, even things that can't be understood. And that in the end, it wasn't a miracle of a river flowing uphill or the walls of a building shaking or even a voice from heaven, that in the end, it was a group of humans, Jews, engaging in the Torah, in the words, and, coming up with something. And of course, that's the way Jewish history has always been. That's why, for many of our ancestors, there was a shtibel on every other corner, a small, little synagogue on every other corner, because one rabbi's group looked at it this way and another rabbi's group looked at it that way. And, people, they go here, and they didn't like that interpretation, they go to the next one down the road. And I think that openness to interpretation, just built into our culture, into our civilization. I'd like to believe God celebrates that when we exercise it. And it's really interesting because what just jumped into my head is something Elie Wiesel used to say all the time. The worst sin is the sin of indifference. Right? And the real loss in Jewish life is when we look at the magnitude of indifference sadly, in the Jewish world, in having debates, as we say in tradition, l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. So I'm glad you asked the question. There's that old joke, which is, someone says, I wish I could find a one-armed rabbi, because I'd like to have a rabbi who's not always saying on the one hand and on the other hand, a one-armed rabbi wouldn't have this problem. But as Jews, we don't look at it as a problem. I know, like when I'll tell you, it's really interesting. I've worked with people, particularly coming from the Catholic Church, where everything is very monolithic in terms of church doctrine, the requirements, and there's some interpretation, but for the most part, everything is fairly dogmatic. And I don't say it as a criticism, I just say it as an observation. And they leave the Catholic Church and they're considering Judaism, and they begin a process of study and learning. And, they'll say, well, what does Judaism say about this or that? And I will answer, well, in the 1st century, they said this. In the 5th century, they said this. In the 11th century, they said this. In the 17th century, before the Enlightenment, they said this. In the 18th century, after the Enlightenment began, they said this. And so they say, well, Rabbi, what's the answer? I'm like, but that is the answer. Miriam.
It just popped into my head. I don't know if it's relevant or not, but it seems to me that the gift that Judaism gives to the world is brain development. And that if we engage in study and in the argumentative process, that it develops the brain and it enables us to think in ways, some people might say outside of the box, some people might say inside the box on the one hand and on the other. But I really think that our gift to the world, for people who engage in the study process, the way Judaism looks at it, is that our brains enable us to think about things in a, I think, particularly unique way.
Yes, Shem.
Hi. So I'm studying the Tanya with Rabbi Levertov in Santa Fe, and actually a theoretical physicist from Los Alamos is in the group, and we're trying to figure out, to understand, the Kabbalah, the Kabbalah from the Chabad perspective, really Hasidic perspective. But one thing that really interests me and excites me really is how important it is that it is important to understand from the mind and then join the mind and the heart in the process of interpretation. And that is, I mean, it became more clear to me why I love to study Jewish history, because no other religion, like theoretical, if I study comparative religion, no other religion honors the mind. No other religion really encourages that dialectical thinking that Miriam was talking about. And that, I mean, I guess, and I've often wondered, do we have an inherent sort of preference for understanding with the mind, as opposed to, like, is it something that's passed on genetically, so that for something, some way of understanding, rather than just going with blind faith as to, they said this, so we have to believe this kind of thing? What do you think, Rabbi? I mean, I'm just like so interested in why it is that grabs me, this way of thinking, more than, another. And I've been asking myself that.
Well, I think I've said this before, that to me, one of the hallmarks of Judaism is our love of the mystery at the heart of things. And instead of just throwing up our hand and saying, well, it's a mystery, nah, let's just move on from it, we engage with the mystery. And I think that's something the world doesn't understand about us, that we engage, think about it, we engage with a God that is invisible, incorporeal. We don't have full words to even describe it, a pure spirit, I mean, whatever it is, however you describe it, and yet we still engage with that. And it's not a hollow exercise.
No.
At all.
At all.
God
And
has
so we have a lot of integrated thinking. We're interested in the confluence of disciplines and, how we can filter the word of Torah through life experience. I mean, the thing that is so interesting, and I'm not aware of any other tradition in the world in the West, because I think there are analogs to some of the things that are Jewish in the East. But the notion of answering complex intellectual questions emanating from the mind's curiosity, answering those with stories of the heart, is something so brilliant and unique, because you can illustrate some things through story. That's not about an equation necessarily, or not about a linear, necessarily even a linear way of thinking. And in Judaism, we encourage this. I mean, it's interesting. Just take the Hebrew word that we associate with story. Often story is called midrash, or a drash is a story about the Torah. But the word lidrosh means to uncover. And so story uncovers things in a unique kind of way, just like poetry uncovers things or reveals things in a very unique way. And in Judaism, we encourage this confluence between our affective experience and our thought-based experience. And we see them as completely connected, if not integrated. And we put a lot of energy into talking about it and are trying to articulate what that connection is between the heart and the mind. That's why, that's one of the things I love most about Judaism. And that's why I feel closest to God. Either in nature or in this group. Because, nature is a source of wonder, and I have to just feel the radical amazement of that. I can tell you, we're in Florida now. And when we first moved to New Mexico 3 years ago, we were taken by the beauty of the desert.
Yes.
But here, it's green. It's just this, it's so different being back in the woods with the green and it feels so alive. Now, I knew there's a lot of life in the desert too, but you don't see it quite as much, right? It blends in because survival in the desert is partly about blending in. And just the contrast of those two experiences, has put us, Loretta and I, you'll laugh when I tell you, but it rains here every afternoon. There are afternoon thunderstorms, big boom, 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 boom thunderstorms every afternoon. And before I started working, we would just sit out on the porch and be awestruck by the thunderstorms, right? And so Judaism encourages what Heschel called that radical amazement. But to just live in a state of radical amazement, that's not the whole picture. The other picture is the dialectical engagement with ideas and stories and principles. And so I'm going to use that as a segue to today's topic, because it will be a good segue. So I'm going to share the screen. Okay. And do the slideshow from the start. So we're going to start a little bit with the Torah portion. It goes right to Miriam's original comment about the mitzvot in this Torah portion. So it turns out the Torah torah Ketetse from Devarim, from Deuteronomy. Rosh Hashanah is just a few weeks away. And before you know it, it'll be Simchat Torah. So we're coming to the end, toward the end of the book of Deuteronomy. And remember, Deuteronomy gets its name Deutero, meaning second, onomy, meaning law. It gets its name referring to the second rendition of the Ten Commandments. But we also know that the writers of Deuteronomy, who wrote later in the history of the kingdom, we're restating a lot of the main commandments of Jewish tradition, reiterating things that are actually said earlier on in the Torah. What's astounding is that in this one parsha of the 613 total mitzvot, there are 74 mitzvot in this parsha. And I picked out 3. In this parsha, and it's not explained. And there are some commandments right in the Torah itself that are actually explained. Why? But there's a whole group of mitzvot that are not explained. And one of them is sending away the mother bird before you take her young for food. Which is really interesting. The young are still eligible to be eaten, but the mother shouldn't see it. That sounds contradictory. I mean, the notion of killing the children as long as the mother doesn't see it. And again, it's a conundrum, really, when you think about it. And we want to, start to think about what's the purpose of this? What is this trying to illustrate? And just think about it for a second. Then another important mitzvah is about paying workers on time and not holding over wages as leverage over workers, and also allowing them to eat on the job. is in this week's Torah portion. And then the other one, interesting and also not explained, the mitzvah of Yibum, which is loosely translated as levirate marriage. And what is Yibum? So you have a woman, a daughter, who marries according to tradition, and then the dowry, just to go back to remember what a dowry really was, and you completely recognize that this is a completely male-dominated, misogynistic universe in which this is articulated. Daughters were considered like property and owned by their fathers. And when a woman would be married, the groom would have to provide a dowry. What was a dowry? A dowry was property or things of value, gold, that were given to the father of the bride and placed in escrow under such cases as the daughter became divorced. The daughter would then have to go back and live at home with her father. And the father would have money now or value to cover the costs of having an adult daughter go back home. And in fact, in ancient Jewish tradition, there was a ceremony of betrothal. And then there was a waiting period of 1 year. And that 1 year was partly there so that the groom and the groom's family could accumulate a dowry. And at the time of the wedding, that dowry would be handed over and kept in escrow in case there was a demise of the marriage or a demise of the husband. But then they added into that the principle of Yibum, which said, if the woman, the daughter, became a widow before, she would revert back to her father's house if the groom had a brother, and now the man is dead, and if he had a brother, Jewish tradition calls upon the brother to marry the widow of his brother. And so rather than, again, to avoid her having to go back home and be under the charge of her father, if it was the case in which she was a widow and there was a living brother to her husband, that brother was required, up to a point, to consider marrying his sister-in-law. And that was the basis of levirate marriage. Now, there was another custom that eventually was described where the brother-in-law had the option of saying no, thank you. And there was a ritual associated with removing her shoe and saying, she's not for me. And then she then would revert back to her father's house. So that is described in this week's Torah portion. And again, ask yourself, what is the purpose behind these three particular commandments? What are they trying to illustrate or articulate? Yes.
I have a sneaking suspicion that it's all about rachamim v'chesed in the end. That's what it's all about. that it's the actual practice of mercy and kindness. And along with, again, what Maimonides says, that it's important to enact the ethics of what the Torah, about what the Torah says. And all three of those that you've picked seem to me to be exactly that. Even the Yibum, when you think about it, it's all about carrying on the genetics of the person she married. And if you want to look at it that way, you can see that it's kindness really to the person who died, to carry on those genetics as best they can. I'm not saying there aren't other monetary and other considerations for it, but in the end, I mean, the base of it is
Okay.
Rachamim v'Chesed.
All right, so hold that thought, because then after you have these three commandments examples, there are others in there, obviously the 74 of them, but these three stand out for a reason. All of the ones that are described in that section in the body of the Parsha have a lot to do with relationships. And we're going to take it one step forward, but then we look at how the Parsha ends. The very last paragraph of the Parsha in Deuteronomy 25, it ends with this. After all of that, it ends with, remember what Amalek did to you on your journey after you left Egypt, how undeterred by fear of God, he surprised you on the march when you were famished and weary and cut down all the stragglers in your rear. Therefore, when your God grants you safety from all your enemies around you in the land that your God is giving you as a hereditary portion, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. And this section about Amalek occurs a number of times, I believe 6 different times in the Torah. And of course, the people of Amalek, the Amalekites, are considered cursed by God. And at other times in Jewish history, God reminds, and this is particularly true in the case of King Saul, to destroy the Amalekites, which he doesn't do effectively. So we have those first examples of mitzvot in this parsha, and then after all of that, it's followed by this. And so I raised the question, and Miriam, you started to answer, what do those mitzvot have in common? And isn't it fascinating that following these mitzvot, we have the admonition about Amalek? And so could the juxtaposition of these mitzvot preceding the admonition about Amalek teach us anything about how to understand extremism? And I'm going to play you a little piece right here.
I happen to know the facts. My friends, I'm just an average American, but I'm an American. And some of the things I see in this country of ours make my blood boil. I see people with foreign money. I see Negroes holding jobs that belong to me and you. Now I ask you, if we allow this thing to go on, what's going to become of us real Americans? Now I
I've heard this kind of talk before, but I never expected to hear it in America.
This fellow seems to know what he's talking about. What are we real Americans going to do about it? You'll find it right here in this little pamphlet. The truth about Negroes and foreigners. The truth about the Catholic Church. You'll find
Do you
out
believe in
who
that kind of
Americans
talk?
are, and you'll find out who
I
you're
don't know,
really.
makes pretty good sense to me.
And I tell you, friends, we'll never be able to call this country our own until it's a country without. Without what? Yeah, without what? Without Negroes. Without alien foreigners. Without Catholics. Without Freemasons. You know these things.
What's wrong with the Masons? I'm a Mason. Hey, that fellow's talking about me.
And that makes a difference, doesn't it?
These are your enemies. These are the people who are trying to take over our country. Now you know them. You know what they stand for. And it's up to you and me to fight them. Fight them and destroy them before they destroy us. Thank you.
Before he said Masons, you were ready to agree with him.
Well, yes, but he was talking about, what about those other people?
In this country, we have no other people. We are American people.
What about you? You aren't American, are you?
I was born in Hungary, but now I am an American citizen. And I have seen what this kind of talk can do. I saw it in Berlin.
What were you doing there?
I was a professor at the university. I heard the same words we have heard today. But I was a fool then. I thought Nazis were crazy people, stupid fanatics. But unfortunately, it was not so.
So. Hold on 1 second.
Unfortunately, some similarity to some of today's rhetoric.
Absolutely. So when we go back to the questions that I posed, Miriam began to answer. The 3 mitzvot we looked at and what they have in common and why they are juxtaposed with the declaration about Amalek. My answer is the 3 mitzvot at the beginning that we looked at are about Judaism's deep commitment to preserving human dignity. And not just human dignity, but as you said, Rahmanut and Chesed, mercy and loving kindness, compassion. It's interesting, the word Rahmanut, which we translate as compassion, actually, the root word of Rahmanut is rechem. It means womb, W-O-M-B, the womb, the compassion of the womb, the selfless, loving caring of the womb, caring without expectation of reward, caring that's based on preserving not just life, but dignity. And if we go back and we look at the 3 mitzvot that I think really are hallmarks of the Parsha, sending away the mother bird is supposed to be compassionate to the mother. That it's just basically undignified behavior for us as humans to take the babies of that mother bird without any sense of compassion. That even in the name of gathering food, we have to keep compassion in the equation. Miriam, just let me finish a second, okay? In paying workers on time and allowing them to eat. That's the difference between preserving the dignity of workers versus treating them as slaves. Or in the example of Yibum, here you have presumably a young widow and in a real state of experiencing abandonment, loss. And levirate marriage is in some ways an attempt to help preserve her dignity so she doesn't have to go back home and revert back to her father's house. And I think that Amalek is reminded to us after these kinds of mitzvot to show the opposite of Rahmanu, the opposite of Chesed, the opposite of what it means to treat people with dignity. Amalek's biggest sin, his biggest transgression was he went after the weak, the elderly, the sick, the people at the back of the line, the slower ones, the disabled ones. And that shows no dignity on his part in his intent to hurt the weakest of all. And the notion of taking advantage of the weak is the height of indignity for everyone involved, for the perpetrator, a total abandonment of any sense of human dignity, and for the victim, again, a total blocking out of any sense of human dignity for people who are weak. So I would argue that extremism, Judaism focuses on human dignity, which is at the heart of the mitzvot, and that extremism in every form is rooted in a negation of human dignity in one way or another. So that's sort of the end of the first part. The transition statement to the second part is the high holidays are designed to provide us a compass that leads us all back to increased human dignity in relationship to each other, in relationship to ourselves, and in relationship to God. So now, Miriam, I'm sorry. Thank you for being patient. Interested in what all of you are thinking at this point.
Listening to you does not require patience on my part.
Oh, well, I didn't mean to cut you off.
You didn't. Although I go farther than what you're saying. I would say that it's not human dignity, because that's a very moderate way of talking about how we should treat each other. I think that this portion is all about avoiding cruelty, being cruel, absolutely cruel, which is a stronger word, I think, than dignified, that human dignity, and that it has a direct relationship with Amalek. If Amalek was only dealing with human dignity, then I don't think we'd be commanded to wipe them. I'm not saying I agree or disagree. I'm just saying to wipe the memory off. I think it's about cruelty.
I think you're right. I think that, yes, I think that I spoke about it in terms of human dignity as preserving human dignity is the opposite of cruelty. So I appreciate your filling that in. I really do. Anyone else?
Me, of course. The way I see it is like and this, I mean, I don't want to deviate from the topic here, but it's like, what is the extent of us as human beings, individual human beings or groups of human beings? What is the balance of power in the universe? It is, to me, that is like not respecting our human limitations as to our place in the universe, in balance of things in the universe, to exert the kind of, like Miriam says, cruelty or an extension of our own imaginary extensive power upon another being, whether it be, birds or another human being, or yeah, to the heart and soul of another human being. How dare we expand our own power onto another? That's how I see it, as a balance, understanding that. I don't know.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
And Miriam, also thank you. Anyone else?
Rabbi, I just want to bring in terms of commandments, we have a commandment even today that we abide by, which is not in this portion, but it is in one of our other portions a couple of times. And that you shall not seethe is it lamb in its mother's milk?
Yep.
That it's the same concept, I think, attached to that first commandment about the mother bird. And it quite possibly could mean, I mean, and the base is still the same, the rachamim v'chesed. If we interpret it that way, that the laws of kashrut really are based on, that's my understanding at least, that commandment, not that commandment alone perhaps, but that commandment that you don't mix meat with milk. But it could actually just mean exactly what the bird commandment means. I'm just mentioning it because, we struggle to understand how to apply some of these laws to the, well, now the 21st century. And we could have it wrong.
No, I think that's a really good comment, because the issue about milk and meat, of course, is confusing to a lot of people. And I happen to agree with you that it's very, you realize there's something subtle about it. It's unseemly, to boil a kid in its mother's milk. There's something that emanates cruelty in that.
Yes.
But it's subtle. It's subtle, but what we do is we then ritualize. We ritualize we ritualize our resistance to that indignity and that cruelty by then not mixing milk and meat products.
All I'm saying, though, is for those of us who are raised in a kosher household, never once, perhaps people, traditional Jewish people think of this every time they don't drink a glass of milk with their meat. Perhaps they do think about that, but I never did. I just followed the law, but I didn't know what it was attached to, nor I certainly didn't think of rachamim v'chesed when I couldn't have ice cream after I had meat.
Or enjoy a cheeseburger.
Right, exactly. I never thought about it, though. That's what I'm saying. So does it lose its power? Does it lose our chance for learning if we obey the laws without understanding why we have the laws in the first place?
Well, let's go back to Rambam and Maimonides. And Maimonides believed understanding the subtlety was just for certain people. And everyone else, it's enough, they should just obey the commandment, because while they may not make an intellectual connection or be taught the subtleties, the esoteric meaning of things, the ritual is an unspoken lesson. It's an unarticulated lesson to those less able to grasp the esoteric meaning. And of course, that's always been my gripe with Rambam, is he is an elitist, like over and over again. One of the things people don't know about Rambam, or I know I discussed it in rabbinic school, and like Rambam rarely gave citations in his writing. Unless he was interpreting a verse from the Torah, and he would tell you what verse it was. But otherwise, he's like, and you know, and you look at the trend of Talmudic and rabbinic literature, citations are at the heart of it. So-and-so said in the name of so-and-so. But Rambam didn't do that. He was a pretty arrogant guy. He was a pretty arrogant guy. He was brilliant, you know, a physician, mathematician, brilliant, a philosopher. But, you know, you weren't told about why we don't mix milk and meat because you weren't eligible to know.
I still think that you cannot make an intelligent decision without a certain level of understanding
Yes.
behind something. And whereas it's true when you're a child, you do it because your parents tell you to do it, etc. At some point, I'm just speaking as a Jew, as a Jewish woman,
Yes.
you know, at some point, we should be old enough to say, do you know why we don't do this? And in my family, at least, it was a more or less modern Orthodox Jewish upbringing. In my family, nobody ever told me. And if it weren't for my active study and reading the Torah for 60 different times, pretty carefully, and groups like this, I would never know.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, I wouldn't be able to make an intelligent decision. I can make decisions, but not an intelligent one.
For sure. And I have to say, just on the whole subject of kashrut, so much of contemporary observance of kashrut across the spectrum are based on customs, things that are not even specifically mentioned in the Torah. I mean, if you ever want an example of the diversity of Jewish cultural experience, just survey people who keep kosher somehow, and you'll hear so many different versions of what people were raised with. And it's fascinating. And I know traditional Jews who will choose their synagogue and rabbi based on the version of kashrut being put forward.
I'm assuming there's some,
Go ahead, Neil.
I'm assuming there's some parallel with, you know, in a Hasidic realm where you're taught to follow the customs, follow the laws, follow the rules, and you really haven't been qualified to learn the Kabbalah till you're 45 years old or whatever that age is.
40.
40, is that it? Until you've experienced the customs and the traditions enough to really get a further understanding of it.
I think the idea of waiting until, you know, what would be considered, certainly in that era, you know, the last third of a lifetime. It was, I think, three things in that. One, a mastery, and it would take that much of a life to master all other Jewish literature, commentaries, and texts. Second, you have enough life experience to reflect on more esoteric spiritual ideas. And I think the third reason they put it off into that stage of life is by then you're going to know if you're interested or not, if it's something you're even inclined to do. I think, like, for example, when I was growing up, we belonged to a conservative synagogue. My great-grandfather kept kosher, strictly kosher at home, went to shul every day after he retired. But he took the family out for Chinese food every Sunday night. You know, like, right? Because we had a family ritual of Chinese food and Ed Sullivan on Sunday nights. And that was just as ritualized and as regular and, you know, cyclical every single week throughout my whole upbringing while he was alive. And yet I considered him a pious man. So, you know, it kind of, we're talking around, what does it mean? Does, Miriam, this is, I think, relates to your comment. Does piety require understanding? And what's the connection there?
I'm not sure how other people feel about this, but I would hope that piety does require understanding and that it's
I agree.
hands down. If you think somebody is pious, you think it's because they understand. They just are not robots like we are, that they actually understand why they're doing it. So that's my position on that. Yes, I think piety requires understanding. But there's an argument about what understanding is. At 30, I understood the Torah in one way. At 40, I understood it another way. So I'm just saying.
No, you're right. Look, let's take an example from halacha. Let's talk about like the mechitza. The mechitza, where men and women are separated in synagogue, and not just in synagogue, at celebrations, a variety of situations, men and women are separate. A lot of different interpretations of it, but mostly has to do with preserving the concentration of two genders, respectively. I'm trying to describe it in a non-sexist way, but that, you know, it's natural for men to be distracted by the presence, you know, of the women in their life that they care about, and vice versa. And that there's powers greater than ourselves that operate between the sexes, whether you agree or disagree. But that it's a prevention of being distracted from and by the way, understand, in Hebrew, the word for worship is avodah, which means work. The work of worship. Now, for me personally, my praying experience is enhanced when Loretta is sitting with me. But that's just me. And I understand some of the reasoning behind the mechitza. But I also then make a decision and say, that reasoning may work for someone, but it doesn't work for me. Because if the halacha's intent is to help enhance my prayer experience, let's say, or our prayer experiences being in separate sides of the room, I'm not willing to go along with that when in my heart of hearts, when Loretta and I are sitting together in synagogue, I feel love around me, even more so, which enhances my sense of connection with everybody else. So all I'm saying is that you can eat, sometimes you learn the meaning of a mitzvah, but you defer to your own judgment. And that's like the argument with the tanor, with the oven, whether it's kosher or not. And I don't know what that means, that, we as Jews don't just have a vote on these matters. In the end, we have our own personal veto. Maybe, maybe not. I'm consciously not an Orthodox Jew, yet I have no disdain for Orthodoxy. I think the different role definitions in traditional Judaism have, a very complex history and, reflect different norms in different communities. But I can tell you, I was raised a conservative Jew, but I consciously chose not to become a conservative rabbi back in 1978 when I started rabbinic school, because JTS and conservative Judaism were not yet ordaining women as rabbis. And that was a stumbling block for me to go to the seminary. So all I'm saying is that piety in some ways is situational, because I felt that by supporting women as rabbis, that was part of my piety, built on a vision of egalitarianism and a resistance to what I felt was some inherent sexism in Jewish tradition. I know the counter argument. And I know why in Orthodoxy there are gender roles. And I've heard it explained, and I listen respectfully, but at the end of the day, I'm still arguing the oven's not kosher for me. And I don't know if that's right or wrong in any universal or grand sense. So I have to make a decision for what's right for me. And that's why I'm a progressive Jew. And that's the definition of progressive Judaism, is it is ultimately comes down to the autonomy of the individual. What do y'all think about that? I don't mean about me, but about this notion that piety is very situational. And I agree with you, Miriam. Understanding the mitzvot is a critical element in one's piety. But that understanding can also cause one to redefine their own piety. And I think that's part of what Maimonides was frightened of, that if you gave people so much information, it could actually draw them away from the mitzvot. He argued that there's some people who can understand the subtleties, learn the subtleties, and it's not going to draw them away from the heart of Judaism. Whereas his opinion was, but if you give people too much information, it's too risky, and it could actually draw them away from the Torah.
And for those who don't want to spend the time to exercise their minds, they can just take things on faith. And for them, that's enough. They don't have to have a rational explanation for why they do what they do or the practices that they pursue.
Well, and I think, humans ritualize all kinds of things without thinking about it. I think of this example, the Pledge of Allegiance. So the original Pledge of Allegiance did not say under God. And into the 1950s, Americans actually believed in leaving that out. That was the norm. And American piety wasn't about under God. And loyalty and fidelity to American democracy. But then the culture changed. And all of a sudden, you could say the Pledge of Allegiance is a reflection of American piety as sort of a declaration. Piety evolved. Now, I wonder, there are some of us, but I think probably not most Americans, who think about, when I say under God, what am I saying? Don't just perform the ritual of the Pledge of Allegiance, but think about the implication of the words. Because I, for one, I'm not comfortable saying, I believe in God, but I'm not saying under God. I don't feel comfortable saying it because not all Americans are traditional believers. And I feel I feel in America, of all places, I have an obligation to respect atheists, even if I'm not an atheist, or the right of an atheist to be an atheist or an agnostic, even if I don't share that belief. And that, in a country that's supposed to be built on pluralism, the phrase under God is exclusion. I hate to say it. You think, how can the rabbi say such a thing? But the phrase under God is exclusionary in a secular democracy. So you see that, again, piety is situational and even changes over time. So should we go on and talk about the high holidays? Before we do, any other comments about this very interesting conversation? Miriam, I'm interested in your response to what I said. And everybody's, in fact, but since you raised the question so well.
What specifically?
The question about piety being, in some ways, there are contingencies around a person's piety. And piety is, I think, something that is kind of in flux.
Yeah, I don't use the word piety. I never have. So,
Okay.
it's not an issue for me. It's just one word that separates people who are more knowledgeable from people who are less knowledgeable. But if you're going to use the word, I still stand by what I said before, and that is the expectation is, at least from my perspective, that if you call a person pious, you have to, I have to believe that they understand why it is they believe what they believe. And when you go to them to listen to them speak, the hope is that they're at least at that point where they understand what it is they're saying and why they're saying it. But that's not necessarily true. I'm just saying that that's my hope.
Part of the reason I asked the question of everybody is, I think sometimes there is an assumption that people who are frum are more knowledgeable. And I don't know if that's true or not.
Just because people are religious doesn't really mean that they understand why it is they're doing what they're doing. And anybody from my background absolutely knows that. It's been a pleasure being a Reformed Jew, an absolute pleasure. And not for 1 minute do I regret being able to study all of our texts, being able to be part of a group like this, being able to learn and be stimulated in a specifically Jewish fashion, whereas before I was excluded from it. So I totally embrace that aspect of Reform Judaism.
Thank you. Any other comments before we move to the next? Okay. So. whoops.
This has been a fascinating portion. Good.
So to talk about the high holidays, we don't just talk about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We talk about a season of the year that actually begins with the month of Elul, which we are now in. And actually, let's see, today is the 14th of Elul. So Rosh Hashanah is exactly 2 weeks from tomorrow night. So Elul is considered a month of preparation for the holidays. And there's a midrash, an interpretation of the word Elul, that each of these 4 letters represent a word in the phrase Ani ledodi v'dodi li. Aleph, Lamed, Vav, Lamed. Form the word Elul, and then it's treated like this is an acrostic of these 4 words, which when translated is often associated with marriages. And people often will have this inscribed on the inside of a wedding ring. Sometimes in Jewish experience, I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. What do you think that is saying? And what might it have to do with preparing for the high holidays? And by the way, you're all very capable Torah interpreters.
It suggests the relationship between us and God.
Yes, there is this marriage between us and God, for sure. And that it's mutual.
Yes.
Anyone else? Okay.
The
So-
relationship. Okay, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, it's not just a relationship, but it's also a focused commitment. Because when you say, I am my beloved's and my beloved's mine, there is a sense of, it's a focus on that relationship. There's the element too.
Yes. I think it's also talking about balance in relationships, equanimity in our relationships, and the marital relationship is unique and set apart. The word kadosh, kodesh, kiddushin, the word for marriage, is for a relationship that is special and set apart from all other relationships. So in the season of Elul, where it's not about getting myself ready to make a quick I'm sorry. Remember that Elul follows the dark month of the Jewish year, the month of Av. Tisha B'Av is in the month of Av. Interestingly, that's the 9th of Av. But did you know there's also a day in Jewish tradition, Tu B'Av, the 15th of the month of Av? Does anybody remember what that is about? It was actually a celebration of the harvest of grapes. And in ancient Israel, it was like a Sadie Hawkins Day. And it's interesting. So you have the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, this dark time, but juxtaposed, as Judaism often does, juxtaposes light and darkness, joy and sadness. So in the month of Av, we're really, we have that juxtaposition of the 9th and the 15th of sadness and joy. In Elul, we're supposed to think about the relationship of the two, the relationship between joy and sadness, light and darkness, that on the surface seem like they're mutually exclusive. We talk about the use of, of darkness as if it's negative, light as if it's positive, white is good, black is bad, instead of seeing them in a mutual continuum of a relationship. And the reminder that life is not either or, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm right. It's ani l'dodi v'dodi li. We're looking for mutuality, to live together in a continuum of equality, so that darkness is part of light. Light is part of darkness. Joy is part of sadness. Sadness is part of joy. We break a glass at a wedding to remind us of the reality of life at a wedding, when we're celebrating the possibilities of life, the possible versus the real. And they are not one or the other. They live in a continuum with each other. So Elul is really suggesting, I think, a real amazing spiritual aspiration, which is to reach a vision, to have the understanding, to know that even in all our relationships, it's not like one person is all right and one person is all wrong. And that the process of teshuvah, of repairing our relationships, is really at the highest level. It's about realizing mutuality, to come out the other end of repentance and repair and reflection with a sense of mutuality and balance in life. And so that one of the basic ways of, we say Elul is this time of self-reflection, where you think about within yourself, the forces of light, the forces of darkness, that they're actually, it's all kind of an integrated continuum. And if we realize that and come to really grasp it, it makes us in general much less judgmental of the faults of others. And I think that's why we also call the season the days of awe. And you think about, we used to use the word in philosophy, in a disjunctive world, where everything is, it's one or the other. It's like a zero-sum view of the world, zero-sum view of relationships. When in fact, again, Judaism, speaking about subtleties and mysteries, is saying, my darkness is not divorced from my light, and vice versa. Where I can see another person who's offended me and done something wrong, I can see myself in them, and they can see themselves in me. So we're told to do, beginning in Elul, an accounting of the soul, a cheshbon hanefesh. But the purpose is not to say, here are the good things I did, here are the bad things I did, and then count it up and say, aha, I did more good than I did bad. It's aiming at something much higher than that. It's aiming to have us develop a sense of rachmanut, of compassion for ourselves and for others, and to develop empathy. And I often think of the Elul, ani l'dodi v'dodi li, it's the statement of mutual empathy between two individuals, mutual empathy between us and others, between us and God. And on this season of the year, we have this opportunity, really incredible opportunity to say, when you do teshuvah, the word lashuv means to change direction. And maybe it's not changing direction from good to bad, from bad to good. Maybe it's the direction of going from being rooted in habits of thought to being more open and aware of what makes us narrow-minded. During Elul, we have some customs, two in particular. We blow the shofar, except on Shabbat, every day during Elul. Again, to try to awaken us to this way of thinking. And we also read Psalm 27 every single day. And Psalm 27 basically says, God is with me in this struggle. God is with me in this process of discernment. God is with me in this process of trying to integrate my life. And so we get to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and the whole season, and I purposely did this. We prepare the language of the Machs or of the High Holiday Prayer Book is the word judgment. Judgment. I don't think that's a helpful word at all. That God, I think it's better to say it's preparing for assessment. It's a time to assess our relationships, the equanimity in our lives, that we become integrated people. And so teshuvah, the turning or changing direction, is about maybe just raising our level of holiness just as much as we possibly can. The other thing is, and I think I've mentioned it before, at least once a year, is, in Judaism, unlike the secular New Year, where people say Happy New Year, and we'll still say it to each other in English colloquially, but Lishana Tova has nothing to do with happiness. Lashana Tova means have a good year. Where goodness takes precedence over happiness. It's not saying happiness is a bad thing. Happiness is a very good thing. But goodness, we're trying to strive for what that is. And, what do we mean by goodness? Does that mean I'm good because I live up to the mitzvot? It could. Does being good mean I'm just a really nice person? So it's a good question to ask yourself. What does it mean to you to be a good person? And the holidays really afford us an opportunity to question that, because maybe what we think is good is no longer relevant. And there are other definitions of goodness out there. Maybe I thought for the longest time that being good was saying yes to anything ever asked of me. And no was not part of my vocabulary. And as long as I did what people asked, I'm a good person. And life has certainly taught me that is definitely not the way to go. Sometimes no is a good response. So this notion, we say, have a good year in Hebrew, Lashana Tova. It's good to wonder, what do you mean by what is the good that is the Archimedean point of your life? And then, we talk about this continuum where, darkness and light are just a continuum with both. I think that's reflected in one of the core prayers of the holidays, namely the Al Chet. And we say this prayer, Al Chet Shechatanu, for the transgression we have committed. And it's always worthy to talk about every year. Why do we say we? Like, you read the list and you go, I didn't do that one, and I didn't do this one. It's a long, long, long prayer. And it's like, for the sin that I have committed by whatever. And I'm like, sorry, that doesn't apply. But we still say we. And I think the reason we say we is, number one, to remind us, if we're living in a world where we see a continuum of experiences, we realize very quickly we are part of a community of imperfection, a community of imperfection, a community of imperfection. And that once we recognize that, we are also a collective making an effort to grow and change. I mean, I hate to use the cliche, but the notion that it takes a village is partly reflected in this notion of Al Chet, that we are in it together. Even the things that I specifically didn't do, I'm still part of the world in which those things happen. I call it the Jewish, we say Al Chet to remind us of the Jewish butterfly effect, which is all of our individual actions impact everyone else's actions. And in response, we have this really kind of remarkable solidarity in the hope of renewal and growth. We have this solidarity that we're going to get beyond the disjunctive worldview and have a more integrated view of ourselves, of God, of the people we care about, of the community we live in. So during the 10 days, the 10 days of repentance, days 1 and 9 focus on repairing human relationships, of finding that integration and balance and equanimity in all of our human relationships. And we're supposed to go to people that we think we've offended or we know we've offended. And we need to try to make repair. And then on day 10, on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which you've heard it, I call it the Day of At-One-ment, where we're looking to find that integrated equanimity on repairing our relationship with God, however we understand that to be. And I always turn to this image from the Sistine Chapel. The rabbis called Yom Kippur also Yom HaKippurim, not just the Day of Atonement, but the Day of Atonements, plural, or the day of at-one-ments, plural. And I always think this is just such a brilliant depiction of this, relationship where we're searching for equanimity and with God. And in this image, we have, of course, we don't believe God can actually be seen. We'll just use this as Michelangelo's motif or metaphor for this. But in this frame from the Sistine Chapel with Adam and God, I mean, look at God. God's like, hey, I'm reaching out. Look at this. I'm stretched out. I want at-one-ment with you. And then you look at Adam as like, kind of like, okay, if you say so. And that's indicative of a relationship where there is not equanimity. It's indicative of a relationship, almost showing passive helplessness on the part of the human and activistic outreach on the part of the divine. And that's why we have Yom HaKippurim. It's the day of at-one-ments. And we talk about on that 10th day, we reflect on this proximity, this symmetry, or lack of proximity, lack of symmetry in those relationships, in our relationship with God. And then I also say, this is, Michelangelo is pretty brilliant. I mean, God, look at, I don't know, that's like, how can you miss that? God's finger is like this, and Moses is kind of like that. I mean, Adam is kind of like that. And Judaism affords us an opportunity to think about what is our proximity. Do we think of God as something divorced from ourselves, separate and distant? Or can we see it integrated? God is part of us. God is within us. In a sense, we are not God, but we have godliness if we create a space for that integration, where we see spirituality as a continuum. The relationship is that continuum, like light and dark are a continuum and integrated. And so, I asked the question, and I think this is the question posed by Yom Kippur. How far are you willing to reach to become closer? And this is really what the High Holidays presents. How far are you willing to reach to become closer to the people you love? How far are you willing to reach to your true self? How far are you willing to reach the earth and all life? How far are you willing to reach to become closer to God as you understand God? And that's the end. Any thoughts about that? A little primer for the holidays. Now,
Thank you so much.
We'll turn
Really.
that off. We'll turn that off.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thoughts?
I had one.
Good.
I had several, but
I don't want to do all the talking, please.
what can I say? I apologize. It's like little one half of my brain trying to connect to the other, I think, the sparks there. But anyway, what you mentioned about the light and darkness, that you really can't separate darkness from light, it made me think of day one in the creation story, because God differentiated the thing about day one. Just day one itself is fascinating, but the fact is that light was created from darkness, and maybe that's something we can think about in terms of the human condition. Well, that's not so easy to be good. You have to make a conscious choice to do it. And Yom Kippur is a wonderful day to do it. And also I wanted to mention, I think you touched upon it, but that I always wondered, and I've said this to many people, but I've always wondered why we feel it's okay to treat our family members, to speak to our family members in ways that we would never speak to a stranger. Shouldn't it be opposite? I mean, shouldn't we speak kindly to our family members and be rude to, or awful to strangers that we'll never see again? I mean, if you had to make that choice, I'm sorry. I mean, hopefully you don't do that to strangers either. But it's the Asara Jemei Teshuvah, the 10 days of Teshuvah. It's a wonderful time to think about why do I behave towards my family in the way I do, and ask for their forgiveness. And that's the hardest. I'm not saying any of that is easy, but reflecting on it is certainly a step in the right direction to stop that kind of behavior and taking advantage or maybe even abusing our right as a family member, our relationships to our family, by not excusing that kind of behavior to our family members.
I think it's profound what you're saying. I imagine, if not all of us, have experienced the at least I have, where family members are the least forgiving of each other, and the sometimes the harshest critics of each other. And the least charitable with each other. In my life as a rabbi, I can't even begin to tell you the number of times I have heard stories of estrangement within families. Because someone made one mistake. And it's tragic, really. It's interesting. I grew up, I only share my story not to talk about me, but just as examples. When my mother, my aunt, and her brother and sister were alive, they fought like cats and dogs. I mean, although now we have a cat and 2 dogs, they don't fight. But they're like, they love each other. But using the idiom of that, they fought all the time. Oh my God, as a child, I used to I think I'll go hide in the closet. They're having a fight. And they would fight, but it didn't matter. We still always got together for every holiday. We still, could argue, but the glue never waned. But I can tell you that the children of those 3 people, interestingly enough, when who grew up with it and witnessed it, and now all 3 of them are gone. And I see with my cousins the anger having been carried down to another generation.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. And now we don't get together at all. Because there are a couple of the cousins, of like 7 cousins, that are just so angry, whatever they're angry about. And I've struggled because I'm the oldest cousin, and I feel like, well, now I need to be the glue that my mother was. And this high holidays, I'm going to be thinking a lot about that, because I miss my cousins and I miss our family being together for holidays. And I guess I'm feeling more sensitive about it because my daughter's getting married in December. And the last major event in the family was my daughter's bat mitzvah, 13 years ago. And I don't think my cousins will show up. And it's just so sad. And I say, for what? Like, for what? And I think that example is so common. Most people don't like to tell it or admit it, but it's good to talk about it. And I think I was avoiding doing this for a long time because I convinced myself I couldn't live up to my mother, who was the real glue of the family. So I've been avoiding it. Now I'm saying, can't do that. Can't do that. Have to face it.
You know, Rabbi, even to your prior point of just because one person made a mistake, and it doesn't always, I don't think it even necessarily comes down to a mistake. I mean, not that we don't do wrong, but it's, just misinterpretation, differences of opinions, and yet, we're not willing to cross that line of acceptance that the other has an opinion that isn't married to mine, doesn't mirror mine. It's a shame. I've had the same experiences myself, unfortunately. Too many.
Thank you for bringing that up. And you're right. I mean, I've seen people in my family be much kinder to strangers than to each other.
Yep.
Well, I have to go, but Shabbat Shalom. And
Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Thank you so much for
This has
sharing.
been great. This has been
Thank you.
fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, everybody, for being there.
Shabbat Shalom, a good week.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Rabbi, for joining us for Florida. I didn't know you were there.
I'm still doing that, and we'll have
Thank you.
we will be having Rosh Hashanah in Trinidad. So
Ah,
Oh,
we'll be there.
lovely. In person, you're gonna go?
Yep. Yep.
Oh, how lovely, how lovely. That's wonderful. Don't forget the Southwest, Rabbi. We're not all,
Not at all. No,
I-
don't worry.
I hope
Don't
you
worry
like
about it.
Florida and the flatlands and the humidity. Good luck to you.
all the best, really.
All right.
Thank you.
Be well,
Bye.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Let me stop the recording. Rabbi, thank you so much.